Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Over the past 24 hours, we've watched with grave concern as over 300 rockets have been fired at Israeli civilians, the latest development in a series of rising tensions and escalations in Israel. Joining us today, live from Israel for an on-the-ground update on the unfolding crisis in Israel is AJC Jerusalem Director Avital Leibovich and I-24 Senior Correspondent Owen Alterman. Moderating today's conversation is Jason Isaacson, AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer. After we hear from Jason, Avital, and Owen, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. And as a reminder, for those of you who registered for our Advocacy Anywhere program, High Stakes, What's Next for U.S. Policy on Iran, you'll be notified shortly with the rescheduled date and time. Jason, Avital, and Owen, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you all for joining us today. In recent days, we've seen on our TV screens scenes of rocket fire from the Gaza Strip into Israel, death and destruction in Israeli towns and cities, farmlands set afire by Gaza-launched incendiary balloons, death and destruction from Israeli retaliatory strikes in Gaza, and violence and angry protests in Jerusalem. It's been horrifying, and I believe for many who are watching, it's been confusing as well. We're going to spend this hour trying to clarify cause and effect, the sources of tension between Israelis and Palestinians, the situation today in Jerusalem, including the status of sites holy to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, who is trying to provoke violence and who is trying to de-escalate and restore calm, and whether there is a feasible path forward toward a political solution and sustainable peace. I'm privileged to be joined in this discussion by two distinguished analysts, my colleague Avital Leibovich, Director of AJC Jerusalem, and Owen Alterman, Senior International Affairs Correspondent for I-24 News. After a few rounds of questions with our panelists, I'll open the floor to questions from you, the viewers. Let's begin. Avital, let me start with you. First, what is the current situation in Israel and in Gaza? Are the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket attacks and incendiary balloon launchings continuing, and what are their effects in Israel? Avital, did you hear my question? Avital?
Hello, Jason. Thank you. Thank you so much for your question, and it's good to be with you here this evening. We are now exactly 25 hours after the initial rocket firing from Gaza to Jerusalem yesterday. This actually was the opening call for a wide attack launched by Hamas and Islamic Jihad as well. And until now, we are talking about more than 500 rockets to different ranges that have been fired from Gaza into Israel. The target of these rockets are civilian areas. Take, for example, the city of Ashkelon. This is a city of 150,000 people, just 4 kilometers away from Gaza. This city was a focal point of an attack of one barrage of rockets after another today, from very early in the morning until now. Just to put it in context, what does it mean, 500 rockets in 25 hours? In the whole year of 2020, the number of rockets that were fired from Gaza to Israel were less than 200 in the whole year of 2020. And here we're talking about 25 hours. In addition to the situation, the Homefront Command, which is the body in charge of communicating with the Israeli public, announced a special situation in all the Israeli cities and communities, Jews, Muslims, within the vicinity of 40 kilometers from Gaza. This means that there is no school tomorrow, there was no school today, people could not go to work, farmers could not work their lands, and basically a lot of restrictions. People in my area, in the Tel Aviv area, can only send their kids to schools if the schools have available shelters for them. One of the concerns that we have right now in Israel is that Hamas and its affiliates will try to expand the range of the rockets. As we know, they do have rockets which could fly over beyond Tel Aviv, beyond Herzliya, something like 115 kilometers. We do know that Hamas actually prepared this attack. It was not something that it was done in a spurge of the moment, not at all. And if you just reminisce for a minute on what Hania said, the leader of Hamas, he said the following: the equation ties between Gaza and strong Jerusalem. So the main goal of Hamas here in the operation, which started yesterday, was to make a very clear-cut connection between Hamas's responsibility to Gaza and Hamas's responsibility, or at least what they aim to be responsible for, which is also Jerusalem. So that's where we are now, an emergency situation. In half of the country, basically, millions of Israelis are either near shelters or in shelters. Unfortunately, two elderly women died today. It's a direct hit of a building, a rocket hit a building, and dozens of others have been wounded. Of course, a lot of damage all over the country. It seems, Jason, that we still have a few more days of us ahead of us of other rounds of rocket firing and the retaliation.
Thank you, Avital. Grim report. Owen, how is Israel responding to these attacks? We've seen terrible pictures of casualties in Gaza. In the midst of these barrages of incoming rockets, as Israeli Defense Forces work to protect the Israeli people, what steps are they taking to avoid civilian casualties?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank you and thank AJC for the invitation, for the opportunity to be here. Really, really excited to join everyone. Also, just so you know, this isn't a fake background. This is our real I-24 newsroom, and obviously a very busy news day. I'll go out of the frame so you can take a little bit of a look. I can't give you a full pan. We have an open space. We have a great team. So also thank you to my colleagues for letting me take the space. As for the situation in terms of protecting civilians, it's up to the lawyers and the military, and they are involved. The Israeli military is a very, very professional team, an experienced team, and a large team that looks at the implications of any potential operation, and they have to sign off on it. They have to sign off on it. They have to sign off on the planning. I believe they have to sign off the moment before it goes into implementation. And so it has to go through a lot of steps and a lot of approvals to get to the stage where some kind of attack is put into effect. The Hamas officials have said 9 children died in an attack yesterday. I don't know that that's been independently confirmed outside of Hamas. And I have questions in my mind about just how reliable the Hamas numbers are. But an attack like that would have gone through the chain of command and would have gone through the lawyer's approval. And it is true that sometimes the Israeli Air Force, the Israeli military conducts attacks where there's a risk of civilian casualties, but that's weighed against the potential benefits operationally and in terms of Israel's interests, as it has to be under the applicable standard international law. So Israel takes steps to do that. And Israel sent a warning to the people of Gaza just a few hours ago, get away from any areas with Hamas weapon stores, because we are about to launch a huge volley of attacks targeting those weapon stores. So please get out of the way. We don't want to hurt you. And as everyone in this call knows, Israel has no interest and no national interest in hitting civilians in Gaza. It only hurts us. It hurts us in the way that you in the United States best understand. International public opinion, which is always in these campaigns, it hasn't quite gotten there, but as all of you know, bitterly, it will get there soon enough, is an important arena in how all of these campaigns play out. One other thing I want to add importantly to the picture of what's going on here, and that's the issue of Israeli Arabs. People here are used, sadly, to rocket fire, particularly in the south of Israel, although not necessarily as intense as it's been over the last day for all of the reasons that Avital mentioned. This idea of mass protests in mixed Arab Jewish cities, most alarmingly in Lod overnight and even this afternoon, but not only there. And of course, the situation in Jerusalem over the last few weeks, but not only in Jerusalem and not only in Lod is something that I think is going to concern a lot of Israelis. Hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews, if not millions, live in mixed cities, live with Arabs as neighbors, oftentimes have very good relations. These protests are not a majority phenomenon. It's only a small group of people who are there, and even a smaller group who might be violent. But the question is, what does the rest of the Israeli public think about this? What does the Israeli Arab leadership think about this? And that's, I think, a question on everyone's minds. And that's, I think, something very, very important for us all to keep our eyes on. It may be something that dies down. It may not be, but it is something I think that really has the attention of the Israeli Jewish public.
Thank you, Owen. Avital, let me ask you, picking up on what Owen was just saying, provoking this reaction, provoking both the rocket fire, but also the protests in Israel. Hamas has played an enormous role in all of that. What are the motivations and intentions of Hamas, the Iran-backed terrorist organization in control of Gaza for the last 14 years? And also, what are the motivations of the Palestinian Authority based in Ramallah? Is this explosion of violence that we've seen attributable to the long-running property dispute that we've been reading about in East Jerusalem over the last several days in East Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which has been very much a focus? But are there broader reasons, or is that the motive, the spark that lit this fire?
Yeah, so we have to look at the broader picture, and as you rightly asked, what is really the motivations of Hamas? So there are a few points here I think worth mentioning. The first one is, as I mentioned before, Hamas for the first time made a direct link between Gaza and Jerusalem. A violent link, but a direct link. Basically, Hamas wishes to present itself as the protector of Al-Aqsa Mosque, as the protector of Jerusalem. Now, you mentioned the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is observed at the same time as very weak. And when you have a weak entity, of course, being Hamas, you would like to place yourself in a higher rank than that Palestinian Authority. So that's the first reason, and I think the main reason for motivation. The second motivation, the reason for motivation of Hamas is basically strengthening its status among the Palestinian streets. Hamas, of course, was anxious to have the local elections, the Palestinian elections. And when this was canceled by Abu Mazen, and we can talk about that later, Hamas understood that he has an opportunity now. And that opportunity is to really walk over the lack of popularity that Abu Mazen, the head of Fatah party, is having or not enjoying from the Palestinian public, and try to lead. Basically, Hamas wishes one day to lead the national Palestinian movement. It succeeded doing so in Gaza for the past 14 years, and it would like to do the same in the West Bank. The third achievement of Hamas, and this is something that Israel needs to analyze and make sure that this does not repeat. Hamas gave Israel an ultimatum. The ultimatum was yesterday, different hours of the day. And basically, Hamas appeared here as the entity which is setting the new rules of game towards Israel. And this is something that was never done in the past. And of course, this helped strengthen Hamas's image. And finally, the last motivation of Hamas does not stop only within the Palestinian areas, but as you mentioned before, there were some riots by young Arab Israelis. One of them was actually not far from my house, and this is an Arab village which we enter on a daily basis. We buy there, they come here, we go there. So this was quite shocking to us as a society here in Israel. But Hamas also was part of incitement towards the Arab Israelis. And by this, Hamas was able to increase its circle of influence beyond the Palestinian arena. So these are the main motivations of Hamas in this current round.
Thank you, Avital. Owen, let me pick up on what Avital was saying about the internal political dynamic among the Palestinians. So yes, President Abbas canceled 2 weeks ago the election for Palestinian legislature that was supposed to take place later this month. But there is, and the assumption was that that was because Hamas was gaining ground politically among the Palestinians who were frustrated with the status quo. What can you share about the internal contest that's unfolding among Palestinian factions, and also what does the future hold for President Abbas, who is 85 years old, is now in the 17th year of his 4-year term? Where will this go politically for the Palestinians?
Well, you're right, 17th year of a 4-year term. And I think for about 15 of those years, we've been asking the same question. And somehow he stays on. He stays on, at least as the titular leader of the Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority is the one that has that seat in the United Nations. They're the ones who can take the Palestinian cause to the international stage. So they still have some tools at their disposal. But obviously, what's happened over the last few days has exposed the weakness of the authority. They don't really seem to have much of a foothold in Palestinian public opinion. As Avital said, Hamas has shown it really can set the agenda and that it really does have traction in large segments of Palestinian society, and even Israeli Arab society is something that we're coming to learn and trying to understand. And look, no question that the cancellation of the Palestinian elections was a key part of what happened here. It really gave Hamas a reason to use its arsenal, a reason to enter into a cycle of confrontation. It gave Hamas something to gain. It gave it an incentive. Time after time in Israel, after there are different escalations, it's said that Hamas only wants quiet. They don't want an escalation. Neither side wants an escalation. It's only a mistake that can get you there. This time is different. This time, there's a sense that Hamas really feels like it has something to gain by escalating, especially by that show in Jerusalem. And don't underestimate the impact of that show, setting an ultimatum at 6 o'clock local time, having that ultimatum not be met, and then immediately firing on Jerusalem. What that means, I would imagine, to those Palestinian protesters standing there in the streets of Jerusalem, when they hear those sirens, see Hamas acting at the end, it's almost Nasrallah-esque in terms of its use of drama to show power and to show force and to show pride from the Palestinian perspective. So I think from Hamas's own perspective, that was very, very effective. And from Israel's perspective, look, the Israeli military has been very, very clear. They are not interested right now in de-escalation because they want to use this opportunity to cause more damage to Hamas infrastructure. They feel that Israel, because of the extent of Hamas's attacks, Israel has legitimacy to really hit back and to really hurt Hamas. And as we all know, that has been, for lack of a better alternative, the consensus strategy for Israel and Gaza going back decades, the so-called mow the lawn strategy of every so often taking aim at Hamas infrastructure, trying to contain it, and then as it grows, attacking it again. Some have said that the same strategy is being used toward the Iranian nuclear program, but for lack of a better alternative strategy in Gaza, and there's been talk about this for decades, this is the strategy Israel comes back to time and time again. The strategy does not seem to have changed, and the Israeli military, it seems, not only seems, but essentially is saying that it is using the current escalation as a chance to implement that strategy.
Can I just add something with your permission?
No, please.
I would like to update the audience as we're speaking. Hamas just gave another ultimatum, basically saying that if Israel doesn't halt the operation immediately, it will fire rockets towards Tel Aviv. And this is the kind of atmosphere that we are now living in Israel. But as for your question, I would like to add a few more facts here about Abu Mazen, especially the Fatah party. So Abu Mazen actually made a huge mistake here with the elections. He was certain that these elections will somehow bring him some strategic achievements. And that was a failed assumption. And he actually understood it quite late, and then he had to cancel the elections. Additionally, we also learned how split the Fatah party is, because the Fatah party was split into 3 groups. It wasn't a unified party. It's wrong to think that there was Hamas on the one side and then a unified Fatah. We had 3 parties, one who supported Abu Mazen, one who supported Dakhlan, and one who supported Barghouti. These are other Palestinian leaders. One of them is sitting in prison. So they were not unified to begin with. And this gave Hamas a stronger point, and they were weakened, of course, by their division. Finally, the end goal of Hamas here was actually very simple. And I think that the international system, the international arena, our friends all over the world misread Hamas's intention. Hamas wanted to have a unity government with Fatah, and then eventually push Fatah away, and again, corrupt Fatah, very weak Fatah, and then take control of the West Bank. And I remember that initially, when the option of unity government came up, I saw a lot of congratulations and different greetings about this initiative of international friends. I also want to say that at this round, or this couple of months, we saw a very fragmented party called Fatah, without motivation, without any organizational base, and Hamas was just the opposite. While Fatah wasn't able to communicate with a younger generation in the Palestinian street, Hamas found a very creative way in inciting and taking them and calling them into action and sending them to the streets. So we also see here a gap with their political capabilities. And one more thing about Israel we need to keep in mind, because there was also a lot of misinformation here. Israel, at the end of the day, was a neutral actor. It did not intervene in the Palestinian elections. It did not say you can have the elections or you cannot have the elections. As you know, Israel has its own political dilemmas. Israel stood by. Of course, for Abu Mazen, it was easy to use Israel to climb down the tree and cancel the elections. But Israel, at least from its perspective, played a very neutral game, and it was right to do that.
Avital, thank you. Owen, let me turn to you and talk about the anti-missile defensive system that Israel has, the very effective, very accurate Iron Dome system. Hundreds of rockets have been fired at Israel, and a very large percentage of them have been eliminated by this Iron Dome system. How important and extensive? By the way, this is a system that was developed in Israel with significant financial support from the United States. But talk about the cooperation between Israel and the United States, the defense cooperation, and how important that is to both countries, the United States and Israel.
The Iron Dome system is essential. It is a game changer for Israel. From the moment it was put into action in 2012, it's absolutely changed the nature of Israel's conflicts with Gaza. From Israel's perspective, much to the better. Most of us, I think, are old enough to remember the 2006 Lebanon war and what that meant when Israel didn't have a system like this, and how different it is when we do, what it means for the military and its options, what it means for the country, what it means for the economy. And of course, we can't say this without two shouts out. One, of course, to then Defense Minister Amir Peretz, who pushed against the military to get this to the finish line and to get this built and to get this implemented and get this deployed. Of course, himself a resident of Sderot, right next to the Gaza Strip, so he understood intuitively how important this was. And again, against the advice of the military and the experts, and yet he did it. And of course, the second shout out to U.S.-Israel cooperation. This is an emblem of U.S.-Israel military and generally cooperation during the Obama era. Incredibly effective, incredibly important, and I think has been a great benefit and a great badge of honor to both Israel and the United States. I should say on the margins, it is interesting. I think back to the 2014 war, and there is on the margins criticism of the Iron Dome, believe it or not. Still, even then, from some former military officials, who felt that it gives Israel a sense of false comfort. And the fact that the Iron Dome can be deployed, and when missiles come in, it can simply shoot the missiles out of the sky, it lowers the incentive, so the argument goes, for Israel to really attack forcefully and to take a forceful offensive operational position vis-a-vis the other side. It's an interesting argument. I don't think most Israelis agree with it. I wonder whether most Israeli military experts agree with it, but I think it's interesting that it's out there. The other very important point, and this is definitely something to keep watching for. It may be that the Iron Dome system can be overwhelmed by large numbers of rockets fired at the same time. And we may, I say this as a may because I don't think I'm in a position to draw a conclusion, but we may have seen that earlier today with the barrage in Ashkelon. 167 rockets, I think, according to Hamas, fired at one time at the city of Ashkelon. We had, unfortunately, 2 Israelis killed, 2 Israeli civilians killed in their homes by rockets that made it through. And they may have made it through because the system may have been overwhelmed. And so this system, for all of its wonders, and again, the technology improves all the time because we learn from flaws in it and make it better. There are new versions, like there are software, but it may not be foolproof. It may have weaknesses that can be exploited. Although again, even on the other side, we had a guest actually on air with us, Night 24 News, a few hours ago, explain that Hamas couldn't pull the same trick, for example, in firing towards central Israel because those missiles are much larger and the military can find them before they're launched. And so they can't be launched in numbers great enough to overwhelm the system. But of course, that doesn't excuse what can happen to southern Israel. And as Avital correctly mentioned, that's hundreds of thousands of people who were spending hours today in shelters. My family and I, it seems surreal, a few days ago, went to Ashkelon. We took our son there. We went to the beach, went to the national park, we went to their wonderful marina. And to see everyone out there is a beautiful place. I hadn't really spent so much time there in the past in one go. And to think what people there are going through. You know, I was, for our channel, I was at Kfar Aza, a kibbutz right next to the border, just I think 2 nights ago, if I'm not mistaken, just before the real escalation. It's just a wonderful place. And the residents there always say that it's a place that they live in because it's just a wonderful, pleasant place. And when you go there and you see, you're there and you feel and you understand their perspective. But at any rate, the Iron Dome, unquestionably a game changer and a real badge of honor, both for Israel and for the United States, for the Israeli government and for the Obama administration. That was so important in getting it done.
And I think it's had more than a 90% effectiveness rate, as I
Yeah.
in knocking down these rockets and mortars as well. And I think it's also important to note, we were talking before, Owen, about Israel's care in targeting these missile launchings, many of which are actually placed in and near Palestinian homes and other civilian locations, and really increasing the dilemma for Israel as it goes after these rocket fire.
Yeah, it's very hard, and there are judgment calls. And my own impression is that the pattern from past conflicts is that the first targets that are hit in the initial days of if this ultimately becomes a full-on conflict, as we saw in 2008, 2009, and 2012 and 2014, in the early days, targets are hit that on one hand have high military value, and on the other hand have low risk of civilian casualties. Those are the easy calls. But once that part of the target bank gets emptied, if you will, then there are tougher calls, and we start to see those play out. And it's there are very difficult decisions for the Israeli military, as we all know, often lead to investigations afterwards, whether they're internal to the military or whether they're, of course, they're external. If you go back to the Goldstone report, look now what the ICC has done and will inevitably do. These are not easy decisions, but I think it's important for all of us to understand they're decisions that are carefully considered. They're decisions that are carefully considered. There are people who look at these with a microscope, who care, who understand the law, who understand Israel's needs, who understand the facts, who get is the best intelligence available, and make the best decision that they can, and are acting in good faith. And I think that's the most important thing for all of us to understand.
And Israel
But it's moreover, it's not just people. Every single target that the Israeli Defense Forces choose has to be authorized with a legal officer. And this has to be chosen with accordance to the international law. So there can't be just a random target that, there's good intelligence and that's enough. And this has been going on for more than a decade. So this is not something new. Now, the Iron Dome has a 90% success rate. It's the only system of its kind in the world. By the way, since the Second Lebanon War, it was another development with the Iron Dome, like a Navy, maritime kind of system, in addition to the classic Iron Dome. But there are also 2 other elements we need to keep in mind. Number one, it's the issue of the Air Force. Israel, of course, has a strong Air Force, and this is another issue relating to what you mentioned before, Jason, the alliance, the strategic alliance between Israel and the US, the F-35 squadron and other types of capabilities. And the third issue is the issue of intelligence. We do have very good intelligence, although Israel has not stepped on Gazan soil since August 2005. We do have good intelligence. Some of this intelligence we share, of course, with our American friends. But all these three factors, great Air Force capability, great interception capability, and great intelligence, actually gives Israel a very strong positioning. Having said that, this is not a normal situation. As we are speaking, there's another siren going off in the southern part of Israel. We'll need to have the government take stronger decisions here on some long-term policy regarding Gaza, because we are caught in one round after another for 20 years.
Avital, let me stay with you and ask, the scenes of violence that have unfolded around the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, with Palestinians attacking Israelis and Israeli forces responding, have gone viral on social media and are being exploited by critics of Israel to fuel a narrative that Israel is trying to take over a Muslim holy site. What is the truth of Israelis' custodianship of the sites that are holy to the three Abrahamic faiths in Jerusalem?
I always like to talk about the facts. And in 1967, Israel legislated a law that deals exactly with those holy places to all religions. And the Temple Mount, of course, is within this law. And basically the law says that only Muslims are allowed to pray in the Temple Mount or Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israelis, which are Jews, and non-Muslims from whichever country in the world, they can come and visit for a few hours every day. There are specific visiting hours. You cannot pray there. You cannot enter the mosque. So this is the law, and it hasn't been changed since 1967. Now, there are tensions from time to time because, unfortunately, we do have in Israel some extreme elements, politicians and religious leaders, at least they call themselves religious leaders among some circles, who like to provoke. They go on the Temple Mount, they bring a TV crew with them. And, you know, from that situation, it's very easy to escalate. Of course, we have the same thing on the Arab side. But at the end of the day, if you look at the numbers of the Ministry of Interior on who visits actually physically that area, you will see that maybe 10% are Jews and 90% are Muslims, because most of Israelis have no interest visiting the Temple Mount. They don't care, they don't want to visit, they're not interested for many reasons. Now, Hamas and the Fatah have always been using the Temple Mount as some kind of incitement element. It's very easy to incite and say, Israel is trying to control Temple Mount. Israel is trying to maybe renovate some areas in Temple Mount, and then send out people to the streets. It has been an issue of friction for decades. At the end of the day, Israel has the full respect for other religions, for other beliefs. And again, the numbers speak for themselves.
Avital, thank you. Let me finish my round here with a question to both of you. And I'll start with you, Owen. After all that has occurred in recent days, what is the path forward? What is required to restore calm, to ease points of friction between Israelis and Palestinians, and to build the trust that would be necessary to move all parties away from conflict and toward a sustainable peace?
I think there are two fronts. First, of course, the core one that we're most focused about for understandable reasons of Israel and Hamas. And there, frankly, just as a matter of reality, both sides have to feel they've achieved their goal. Hamas, in some sense, I think already feels it achieved its goal. It set the tone, as Avital said correctly, the ultimatum in Jerusalem, and then the volley of rockets toward Jerusalem immediately afterwards, as I mentioned, I think was incredibly effective. And I imagine for the public that Hamas cares about, was incredibly effective. The Israeli military doesn't want that to be the picture that we all remember from the war. It wants to achieve other gains, as I mentioned, and it has been very, very clear that it's not going to rest until it has achieved them. The military has said it's a matter of days, not hours. So we're still in the process of days. And the question then becomes, does it become weeks and not days, as it did, for example, in 2014? In that sense, I can say that after the 2014 war, there were a lot of people who were not happy about the duration of the war here. Who felt that it needed to be quicker from Israel's perspective, that it was too slow, that it enacted too many costs, and for that reason was less effective than it could have been. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that perspective is out there and might have an impact on the planning here. From Hamas's perspective, they don't want to be seen as losing. They don't want to be seen as backing down. They don't want to be seen as no longer setting the agenda. One would imagine that's why they keep setting ultimatums. And as long as they feel they can set ultimatums and have the upper hand, then it seems like they'll continue. How do you get to a position where both sides can claim they've achieved their goals and de-escalate? It will happen eventually. It always does. Of course, the question is how long, and of course, the question is how, and of course, the question is through what kind of mediation and what kinds of compromises. And I'm sure we're going to be getting there in a few days, and it's obviously delicate and complicated. So the longer term situation in Gaza, look, Avital mentioned we have to look for a new strategy. The problem is we've been looking for 20 years and we don't have one. We don't have another strategy for Gaza. Politicians like to complain that it's so such and such politician's fault. And if I get into office, I'm going to do X, and he's in office and he's doing Y. And we're already hearing that. We're going to hear that over the next week. I could use a stronger word, but I'll use the word baloney. None of it's true. Nobody has a better idea what to do with Gaza. Only a handful of Israeli politicians are willing to go to the television cameras and say, Israel should reoccupy Gaza. We fully understand the cost. We fully understand the casualties. We fully understand what it means in the international arena for all of you and what you do. We fully understand how long it would take, and we're willing to accept those costs. That's a position that can be taken, but you won't find too many politicians who are willing to actually take that. The second arena is, of course, the issue of Arabs and Jews in Israel. And this is something we're all going to be watching. On one hand, what we've seen over the last year is a real interest on the parts of large sectors of the Israeli Arab population here to integrate in Israeli society and Israeli politics. This is also part of a much longer term trend that goes back decades. It has to with fields ranging from education to professions, to culture and beyond. But on the one hand, you can have that and believe that. And I believe at the same time, not be willing to relinquish your political opinions about Zionism, about how you see what happened in 1948. How do you balance those two? And how does the Jewish public respond to someone who wants to integrate, and on the other hand, believes that the state of Israel is responsible for banishing the person's family members from the country? How does that play out? And how does that get squared? And what does that mean for Israeli politics? Very complicated questions. I don't know that they're going to be resolved in the next week or two, but they're going to be asked. And we're going to be talking about them a lot.
Owen, thank you. Avital, your view of a path forward.
Yeah, with your permission, I'd like to put aside for a moment the internal Israeli issues with the Arab Israelis. I'd like to focus only on the issue of Gaza. And the way I would like to answer your question, Jason, is by sharing a dilemma, which I call the Qatari money dilemma. And this, I think, is an example of the situation Israel is dealing with. On the one hand, Israel allows Qatari representatives to enter the Gaza Strip and give funding to Hamas and the people who live in Gaza. Of course, this is meant for welfare, for improving their economic situation. But on the other hand, this very simple move is actually strengthening Hamas and allows Hamas to lead some sort of a policy which basically weakens the Palestinian Authority, because Hamas is keeping this relationship with Qatar. Hamas is making sure the money is flowing into Gaza. And this is really the dilemma. For the next couple of days, Israel needs to act in the following take the following three steps. Number one, Israel needs to retaliate in a very strong way. Of course, I'm not talking about targeting civilians. I'm talking about terror targets. I'm talking about tunnels. I'm talking about caches of rockets. We cannot stand a situation of rocket fire on our cities 24/7. So that's number one. Number two, the Israeli leadership, the Israeli government needs to do everything in order to leave Judea and Samaria or the West Bank outside of this violent circle. They need to give them easings. They need to send messages. There are different ways to do that. They cannot be a part of this situation. And the third thing the government needs to do is to neutralize extreme Jewish elements. We have a few of them, but they're extreme and they can create some chaotic movements here. They can burn an olive grove or a Palestinian vehicle. So we need to calm all the other areas while we are retaliating against Hamas targets. This is something that we need to do in the really near future. I think this will be around of a few more days. I don't see the situation escalating to an all kind of war or something of that sort, but we will need to be patient because this has a price for us living here in Israel.
Excellent. Thank you, Avital. Daniel, let's open it up to questions from our viewers.
Thank you, Jason. And we have over 100 questions that have come in already, so I apologize if we don't get to all of them today. But our first question, and Owen, I'll direct this one to you. A lot of people are asking to give a bit more explanation to the situation in Sheikh Jarrah. Is Israel forcibly removing Palestinians from their homes? If so, why? What is really happening, and how much did this affect the current tensions?
Well, I'll start with the end first. How much did it affect the current tensions? It was a kind of proximate cause, but obviously not a deeper cause. There's obviously a lot of other issues going on. Look, the situation in Sheikh Jarrah goes back a long time. These are properties that were held by Jews before 1948, again, when the entire country was under a British mandate and Arabs and Jews lived in some sense in all of it. Of course, there were areas that were much more heavily populated by Jews and others more heavily populated by Arabs, which gave rise to a partition plan. But it was inevitable that some Jews and some Arabs would be caught on the other sides of those lines. And particularly Arabs were, but also some Jews. So of course, in 1948, the Jordanians occupied East Jerusalem, including this area. And the British had asked the Jews who owned these properties to leave them before the Jordanians came to avoid bloodshed. And of course, in 1967, the Israeli military comes back, Israeli rule comes back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is annexed. And these owners go to court and say, we want our property back. It's ours. And it's been tied up in the courts really ever since. They ultimately sold it to another group that has a more direct political agenda of what they want to see happen in East Jerusalem, some of the kinds of groups that Avital was just alluding to with a very far-right agenda. And obviously it creates a lot of friction. The latest is that there was a court ruling that's supposed to come down. The court is delayed giving its ruling. And so for now, the Palestinian families that live in these buildings are still there. But again, land and property is a very, very touchy issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As we all know, if this principle were to be applied uniformly, that areas held by Jews before 1948 and held by Arabs before 1948 were to go back to their previous owner, it's not necessarily a result that would be to Israel's benefit in the bigger picture. So I think Israel has to be very, very careful here. And for all of the calls, sort of Zev Jabotinsky-esque calls that we hear from the Israeli right over the course of the past week, that Israel has the right to do this or that, it has to exercise its rights in the capital, it has to be proud, it shouldn't listen to criticism, it should simply move forward, because backing down would simply invite further concessions and erode Israel's position. On the other hand, there's another view that there is a space for common sense concessions to try to quiet the atmosphere. We saw that, for example, by Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision to change the route of the Jerusalem Day flag parade. This is for viewers who don't know, this is an annual parade of religious Jewish youth on Jerusalem Day, the anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem, the Six-Day War, to celebrate Jerusalem and march in a parade. So far, very straightforward, but they actually do it through the heart of the Muslim quarter. And I've seen it. It's very uncomfortable from the perspective of Muslims who live there. And in some sense, the Sheikh Jarrah situation is similar. In any event, Israel did postpone the hearing. We've still had the escalation. So there are obviously many, many other things going on, including especially perhaps Hamas's own intentions and incentives that we've talked so much about.
I would just like to add two more short things. Number one, you say Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. It sounds like a neighborhood. We're talking about 28 houses. This is the number one. Number two, Palestinians can go to the court as well, can appeal and show documentation of ownership on the house. Just like those Jews who claim to have the house belong to them can do the same. So there's an equation between the two. And at the end of the day, it's a judicial decision. And finally, I just want to say one sentence. The issue is not the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. The issue is the status of Jerusalem and who does Jerusalem belong to. This is the bigger picture. And this is how we need to look at the situation, not only to a 200-meter long street and 28 houses. This is more strategic with more meaning, of course, than just a few houses.
Thank you. Daniel?
Thank you. Avital, I'll direct this next question to you. And it's a two-part question. The first part comes from AJC Honorary President John Shapiro, who's asking, how does the current situation impact the political situation in Israel? And then following up on that, Martin Krall is asking, given the political paralysis in Israel, who will make major decisions concerning Israel's Gaza strategy?
Great questions. So you asked some Israelis, what is the impact on the of the operation, the current impact, and they say it's a joke that actually it prevented some sort of a unity government with an Arab party, because the deterioration on the streets last night, in many mixed Arab Jewish cities here in Israel, actually took the politicians by surprise. And I'm talking primarily about Bennett, who is the head of the Yamina party, and Yair Lapid. Both are aiming right now to build a unity government, but in order to have 61 seats for a unity government, they will need the Arab party called Ra'am. And the Arab party is sitting very quietly, but this is not the Zionist party. And this is exactly the situation they were concerned of, a situation of an uprising by Muslims or some kind of a military situation in Gaza. And this is something this party would never support. So right now they halted the discussions for unity. And according to the political analysts in Israel, the chances of having this unity government, when last week they seemed bigger, this week they seem more slim. And as for the current situation, if there is one thing in this country which runs well, it's emergency situations. So there is a cabinet which meets together. We do have still a minister of defense, which is Benny Gantz. The prime minister is leading the cabinet, and they do take decisions on emergency and defense situations. The last decision the cabinet made was actually yesterday. The security apparatus presented different scenarios of modus operandi, and actually the cabinet approved these plans, and right now the IDF is fulfilling these plans in Gaza.
A couple more things to add, if I may. What Avital said is the consensus view in Israel about what this means to the political situation. I completely subscribe to it, but with a couple caveats. One is a number, and that number is 43. And that is the number of days until new elections are triggered. That's the number of days in which a government could potentially be formed. 22 more days in which Yair Lapid holds the mandate, the exclusive right to form a government. 21 more days when it's in the hands of the Israeli parliament. If in fact the situation calms down in the next few days, we could over the course of another few weeks be at a place where somehow, some way, Ra'am could play some part in the government being formed. I agree, even in that scenario, it doesn't seem particularly likely right now. The memories of the pictures from Lod, the memories of the destruction of that religious elementary school in Lod are fresh in people's minds. And so I don't necessarily think it's a likely scenario, but it certainly is out there. The other thing to keep in mind is this government doesn't have to be built to last. All it has to do, from the perspective of many of its participants, is be sworn in. And the moment it's sworn in, Naftali Bennett will become prime minister. He'll be the prime minister of a transitional government, even if the government falls the next day. Netanyahu will be out of office. They'll have achieved their main objective, at least in the interim. And also just to remind people, if a government's not formed, by far the most likely scenario, a fifth set of elections, although again, it's going to take a month and a half to get there.
Yeah, but the last thing you really want is a government that falls after 1 week or after 2 weeks or after 1 month. We need here a stable government, a strong government that will be able to run the country, and not something which is a transition kind of mode government. So I hope that we won't have fifth elections. And, I hope, as many other Israeli citizens hope, we'll have a permanent, stable government. But who knows? We'll know in 22 days.
Thank you. Daniel, do we have time for one more quick question?
Yeah, I'll ask one more from Rami in Jerusalem before we turn it over to AJC CEO David Harris for concluding remarks. So, Owen, tensions in the region and here in Jerusalem in particular, this is from Rami in Jerusalem, had been steadily building for several weeks with Palestinian riots on a nightly basis. Yet somehow the media narrative has placed the blame on Israel's shoulders, centering the conversation on the real estate dispute that you just discussed. Why is this, and how can the narrative be shifted more in Israel's favor?
Well, first of all, you're all better able to testify about how this is being seen internationally than I am. Obviously, I have access to international media. I read it, so I see it. And you're right. Look, it's a complex situation on which there may be blame on both sides. Avital mentioned far-right groups. We had one night in Jerusalem a couple weeks ago when a group called Lehava walked through the streets saying Arabs out or death to Arabs. Obviously, that's not going to be a welcome message in the middle of Ramadan when you're walking through the middle of East Jerusalem. There are even lesser steps like the flag parade, which again is seen as a provocation. Other steps by far-right activists. That doesn't excuse violence, and I wouldn't say in any way that it does. But again, it creates a more mixed picture. Look, it's a matter of advocacy. It's a matter of media criticism. You're all very experienced at this, I know. It's a part and parcel of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's become a core arena of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with an impact on what options Israeli policymakers and military planners have here. But I think a lot of it is about emphasizing the professionalism of the Israeli authorities, of the military, of the police, that they're doing their best, that Jerusalem is kept as an open city, that there's freedom of worship throughout the city, that the old city is one of the most complicated, I would imagine, complicated areas in the world to police. And the Israeli police do an exemplary job. Again, don't forget, in addition to having Ramadan, in addition to having these protests, in addition to having Jerusalem Day, you also had Holy Week for Orthodox Christians, which may sound esoteric to people on this call. But again, we're in the middle of at the tail end of a pandemic, so tens of thousands of pilgrims don't come in. But we still had a major events over the course of that week that have to be policed by the Israeli border police. So again, I think emphasizing the professionalism, the good faith, the record on running Jerusalem, to me, and the attempts at compromise also in Sheikh Jarrah and in other areas that the Israeli authorities have meant to do to show Israel's goodwill, that seems to me to be a really, really important part of the puzzle.
Owen, thank you. Avital, thank you. And now it's my privilege to introduce AJC CEO David Harris. David, the floor is yours.
Jason, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank Avital and Owen for such an in-depth and I think quite remarkable analysis of the unfolding situation. And thank you, Jason, for moderating it. This is one of our largest audiences ever. And I think it reflects the degree of concern that all of us have at this moment in time. I want to begin by saying that I'm in awe of Israel and the Israelis yet again. I'm in awe because this country being subjected to what it is being subjected to is managing to respond with calm, with national resilience, with fearlessness, with a commitment to the future, and with a responsibility to act not simply out of haste or anger or passion, though they would be understandable, but rather balancing all of the respective challenges we just heard about from both Avital and Owen. Secondly, I hope after this conversation especially that everyone sort of admits to a certain need for intellectual humility here. It's often tempting, especially from afar, sitting on one's couch or at one's desk to try and decide issues for Israel. Don't they seem so easy, so clear cut, so black and white from where we're sitting? And yet, as you just heard, they're anything but. And one Israeli leader after another has tried and essentially failed to develop a long-term Gaza strategy, because that long-term Gaza strategy is not obvious. On the one hand, Israel cannot change its geography. It's destined to live alongside this Gaza Strip. Israel can also not change the outcome of what happened in the street when Hamas overthrew the Palestinian Authority violently in 2007. And yet Israel at the same time cannot engage in the kind of carpet bombing that we saw in World War II that would simply turn Gaza into rubble. So notwithstanding the criticism that Israel often hears in the international community, the fact of the matter is that Israel is walking this extraordinarily tight tightrope, and I think doing about as good a job as it can, because there are no easy, obvious overnight solutions to the challenges of Gaza. My third point, there are those who still want to over-intellectualize what's going on. Well, let's really dig deep into Sheikh Jarrah and understand all of the legal ramifications going back a century. Or let's try and understand even better, was Israel in any way, shape, or form at fault in denying access to any single worshiping Muslim at Al-Aqsa? Yes, those are contributing issues, or I think Owen said proximate issues, but we need to step back and we need to look at the larger picture as we gather for this phone call. Hundreds upon hundreds of missiles and rockets are being fired from Gaza across Israel, including Israel's capital, destroying fields, damaging homes, and most importantly, now killing and wounding people. And I ask a question that I asked last Thursday for those of you who joined us at our last Advocacy Anywhere call. Where is the outrage? Where is our outrage knowing that Israel, which walked out of Gaza in 2005, which gave Gaza its first chance in history, something that neither Egypt nor Ottoman Turkey ever thought to do in their years and centuries of occupation of Gaza. It gave Gaza its first chance to govern itself. It gave Gaza its first chance to decide, shall we seek to become Singapore or shall we seek to become Syria? And tragically, the choice was made to become Syria and not Singapore. And so we have today a regime, Hamas, which is, let's call it by its name, a genocidal regime that seeks ultimately a world without Israel. And Israel will not indulge the wish of Hamas. So it seems to me that this is one of those defining moments, not just for the Israeli people and their national resilience, which we applaud from afar, and not just for the IDF, which has always shown such extraordinary courage and ingenuity. This is a defining moment for us. This is a defining moment for us to get out of the weeds and stand up and define who we are. We stand with Israel. American Jewish Committee stands with Israel and the people of Israel as we have stood for years and decades. And as one who traveled to Israel in 1991 in the very first delegation by AJC to sit in sealed rooms with the Israelis when Scud missiles were coming from Iraq, and who led an AJC delegation in 2006 when missiles were raining down on Israel from Lebanon, and who traveled to Israel again with delegations in 2012 and 14 to show our solidarity when missiles were coming from Gaza, and who have raised funds to support Israeli hospitals, emergency rooms, ambulances, and other emergency services. As an organization that has stood up loudly in Washington to say, we call on the administration and both parties to stand up clearly and to say without ambiguity, without any wishy-washiness, that moral clarity is clear. We stand with Israel in its right to defend itself against genocidal terror. We, AJC, are also standing up in the capitals of Europe and elsewhere around the world through our global network to call on governments. In some cases, they don't need to be called on, they're there. But in other cases, they're squeamish. They're standing on the 50-yard line. They're hiding behind these antiseptic phrases like cycles of violence and de-escalation by all sides, as if there weren't clarity between the arsonist, Hamas, and the fireman, Israel. So for those of you who are not yet part of the AJC family, who are not yet part of this global advocacy movement, this is the moment we believe when we hope you'll consider joining us as we stand together and we say, Israel is not alone today. Israel will never be alone.
Thank you, David. And thank you again to Avital and Owen for joining us. As David said, please join AJC in standing with Israel by visiting our website at ajc.org. You'll also find a link to AJC CEO David Harris's latest op-ed on the crisis, which is featured today in the Times of Israel. And to stay up to date on the most pressing issues facing Israel, the Jewish people, and the world, please follow us on Twitter or Facebook by searching AJC Global. Thank you again, everyone, and goodbye.